It's very, very exciting for me to be here, and a little bit strange to speak in English, but I will continue doing so as it looks like is the tradition. So it's exciting to be here for lots of reasons, but one of them is that I did my BA here, as Tom mentioned, about 20 years ago. And it was a very important and kind of transformative experience for me. And in my first year as a student here at Tel Aviv University in Gilman and in Sharet, I took Matti Mintz's biological psychology course. And I was completely fascinated with this idea that we can understand human mind, the human cognition, in terms of the orchestration and activity of biological cells in our brains. I thought it was just incredibly mysterious and interesting, and it really is that experience is what set me on the path to where I am today. So I have many very rich experiences and memories of those times when I was here. I remember, which I didn't until I walked in, but I remember taking an exam in this room on the history of the Middle Ages. I'm like on the tip of my tongue, I could tell you what the questions were on the exam. And you have other very detailed, rich memories of interactions with Matti and with Galit and with others here, of sitting at the cafeteria. And other interesting memories. And one of the really interesting questions standing here 20 years later is, to what extent are those memories actually accurate? I could tell you what those questions were on the exam, but I could be wrong. You would never know, neither would I. Moreover, not just are they accurate, but why is it that some aspects of those experiences are sort of etched in my memory 20 years later, and other aspects of those experiences completely gone, many moments that were not retained in memory at all. And I think one of the most fascinating questions for me in that context is not just which memories are there or not, but why are there memories there? What use is it for me now to be able to stand here and retrieve memories of something that happened 20 years ago when that thing is not necessarily going to repeat? And yet, I think the main question driving a lot of my research is not just whether those memories are there, but how do they influence our behavior? How have they shaped who I am? How do those sorts of memories shape the decisions and actions we take every day? So not just the big decision to leave here and pursue a PhD and a career in science, but even the small questions like whether to order hummus or not at the cafeteria. So a lot of our everyday questions, no doubt, are heavily influenced by our memories, even when we're unaware of them. And that's, in a nutshell, the question that my research tries to answer is, how does that happen? How are our everyday decisions influenced by memory? And by how does that happen, we really mean how does that happen in the brain? How is it that neurons can encode experiences in a way that changes the brain long term, and that then influences the way we interact with the world, which of course then comes back to influence our brain. So that's kind of the question that keeps me awake at night, and that we've been trying to pursue in my lab. And I'm going to tell you today sort of just a little bit of some of the studies we've been doing, trying to get at that question, to give you sort of a taste of how we ask that question in humans, and what are some of the answers that we're finding. And I'll say from the get-go, Tommy, you'll tell me when it's time to end, but if there are any questions in between, feel free to ask, and I promise I will, retrieve my Israeli roots and stop you if it gets out of hand. Okay, so that's just representing my memory. So how are decisions shaped by past experience? And I just realized I don't need to use this. You can hear me through the other mic. So one sort of textbook level answer to the question of how do we encode past experiences and how do they influence our behavior comes from decades of research in neuroscience and in cognitive psychology that suggests that the brain encodes experiences in more than one way, that we have multiple systems for learning and memory in the brain, and that they build different kinds of memories. So the two that most people have focused on, that I'm going to focus on in my talk and focus on my work, are the striatum and the hippocampus, two structures in the brain that have very different kinds of architecture, very different patterns of connectivity with other parts of the brain, and that we think serve very different sorts of functions. So what your textbook will tell you is that going back to patient HM and with decades of follow-up work since, that the hippocampus is important for what people, like Larry Squire and others, like to term declarative memory, or explicit memories for that you can report for things that you did, let's say, 20 years ago. I can share with you that I took an exam in this room. That's a classic textbook example of declarative memory. And a lot of the early work, and I'm sort of setting this up for a little bit of an argument or a contrast, but a lot of the early work really emphasized how important conscious awareness is for this picture, that what your hippocampus does is builds memories that you can access with conscious awareness, okay? Which I ultimately think is actually not true. And that the reason that sort of one of the unique features of this hippocampal memory is that it's flexible, that we can retrieve it and use it, and that it allows us to use our memories when we stop and think about it. Okay? Which, again, I'm going to sort of argue is not entirely the right way to be thinking about this. But going back to early studies, that was sort of contrasted with the role of the striatum as doing basically the opposite. And people had identified the striatum as being an important structure for building unconscious, implicit memories for how to do things, not what you had for breakfast perhaps, but how to eat your breakfast, things like skills and habits. And that these were sort of two separate kinds of memory that work in parallel and to learn different kinds of information. And this idea that goes back really way back now, as I mentioned, to patient HM, and mostly to findings from patients who have damage to either the hippocampus or the striatum. And the early sort of neuropsychological work with patients found that if you look at patients with different kinds of damage, you find these distinct double dissociable patterns of damage to either the ability to learn lists of words or the ability to learn how to perform skills. So I think one of the important conclusions from the work of many people over the last decade or so has been that this textbook view, that I think is probably still in most textbooks, is really not so simple. It's not that it's wrong so much as it offers a useful oversimplification that we can now build on and elaborate. And I think we have a sort of different view of the world now. And there are some of the problems that emerge from that perspective is that the last decade or so of work on decision making and how we sort of learn to choose things that will be more rewarding for us and make those kind of decisions has really focused only on habits and almost only on the striatum. So most of the work on value-based decision making has treated it as if it's always habitual and has almost entirely ignored the idea that other forms of memory might also be important for decision making, and that's sort of one open gap that we've been trying to address. Another very kind of blatant problem with that two-system cartoon, if you will, is that it really ignores the fact that in the brain, of course, there are many opportunities for crosstalk between the striatum and the hippocampus through many routes, subcortical routes, prefrontal routes, but that clearly we should not be thinking from the neurobiological perspective of these two structures as being independent of each other. They have a lot of common inputs, a lot of common outputs, and so we really need to understand, to the extent that they are doing something different in learning, how are they sharing that information, when are they sharing that information, and how can we understand the nature of the interactions between them, both neurally and the implications for behavior. And then the third point I've alluded to already is this issue of conscious awareness, which is that early models really emphasized that that was a distinguishing factor. If you push me on this issue of conscious awareness at the very end, I have probably more to say than you want to hear at the moment, so I'll resist. But I'll just say I think that the problem with the emphasis on conscious awareness, first, is that it really held back efforts to bridge between animal work and human work, because when the human work came and said it's all about conscious awareness and made it very difficult to leverage a lot of the data in animals where it's harder to assess whether a memory is consciously aware or not. So it really sort of held things back from that perspective. But I think moreover now there's a lot of evidence that suggests that even the hippocampus, which is supposed to be the structure supporting consciously aware memories, that's not actually what it does, and that we can think of other ways to characterize the kinds of memories that the hippocampus builds, and that those memories are there regardless of whether they're consciously accessible or not. Okay, so I'll show you some examples of that later on. To summarize, I guess, about a decade of work, basically where we are today is that there's more and more work suggesting that this idea of conscious awareness is not the right way to differentiate or understand what the striatum and the hippocampus are doing for memory, and that instead we can focus on the kinds of knowledge or representations or associations that these two structures are building, and that one of the key differences is that the striatum is really encoding information over averages of experiences, so cumulative experiences, and represents some kind of average value of an action or a cue, whereas the hippocampus encodes moment-by-moment episodes in time rather than whether they're accessible or not, so kind of a moment bridging across time and space. And that in that sense, one useful characterization of what the hippocampus does is that it's building stimulus-stimulus associations, and this is an idea that goes back to work in animals that has tried to characterize what the hippocampus does for spatial navigation, and the idea that your hippocampus right now potentially is encoding the relationship between one stimulus, me standing in the room, and the room itself, and the screen, and that it's this sort of complex associative structure that is a unique feature of memories built by the hippocampus, whereas the striatum is much more sort of specialized for associating a particular cue with a response. So see me speaking and maybe go check your phone, or some other kind of response perhaps. And I think another really important finding to come out of a lot of research regarding the hippocampus is that these episodes, even though we like to think of them as being related to memory, are actually not unique to thinking about things in the past. That we use this structure for imagining episodes in the future as well as retrieving episodes from the past. So that really what the hippocampus is doing is something that has to do with construction of rich stimulus-stimulus associations, whether they actually happened or whether you're constructing them to imagine what you're going to be doing later today or on your vacation or next year. And finally, with all this, I think there's now really extensive evidence that suggests that rather than thinking of these systems as separate systems, we should be thinking of them as interacting. This turns out to be a very difficult thing to characterize, and there's now, if you search for it, evidence that the striatum and the hippocampus compete with each other, which was sort of the initial point of view, that these two forms of memory shut each other down, compete for control of behavior. And now there's a lot of evidence, and I'll show you some, that the striatum and the hippocampus actually work together and share information and cooperatively control behavior, and there are sort of neural pathways to support both of these forms of interactions. So that's if you do have to check your phone, if you zone out, that's the main thing I want you to take away from today. And now let me show you some of the evidence behind some of those claims. So what I'm going to tell you about first is this question of episodes. How does sort of a single experience, a single moment in time guide our decisions? Then I'm going to show you some evidence from functional imaging, fMRI in humans, looking at showing evidence for interactions, cooperation between the striatum and the hippocampus, as well as competition between the hippocampus and the striatum during learning and decision making. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas of integration of memories, trying to address the question of how multiple memories become connected together to sort of form a network or a narrative or a schema, or kind of allow generalizing information from one memory to another. And then if I have time at the end, I'll tell you just some new, more theoretical ideas about how this actually works at a very simple, mysterious level of where does a memory come from and how does it get to where a decision needs to be made in terms of neural circuits and computations. All right, so let me start. So the basic idea now is that there's extensive evidence that suggests that the hippocampus supports memories that are episodic, a moment in time, that are relational, containing information about relations between stimuli and other stimuli, and that are motivated. So this is sort of the current view of how the hippocampus builds memories. And so for those of us who are interested in decision making, the question becomes, how do such memories guide decisions, and how do they trade off with this sort of average value representation that is built in the striatum? So this turns out to be a very difficult question to answer, mostly because tasks out there in the literature either ask people to make the same choice over and over and over and over again, like going to your cafeteria every day of the week and sampling the food and discovering through trial and error which one is better, tens of times, hundreds of times. Or studies have looked at memory for one event and tested whether you remember something that happened only once. So what we wanted to do is really bring these two sorts of behaviors together to ask questions about how a one-time episode interacts with value to influence decision making. And the task I'm going to show you that tried to accomplish this is designed by a former postdoc in my lab, Catherine Duncan. She's now a professor at the University of Toronto and is looking for postdocs, by the way. And here's what Catherine and I worked on. Catherine and I took a task which in of itself at its core has been used many times before. Some people refer to this as a bandit task. It's a classic kind of reward learning task where you walk into the lab and you're sitting at the computer and we show you two shapes here, two squares, one red, one blue, and you have to choose one. And if you choose the correct one, you receive a monetary reward. And in this case, if you choose the correct one, you'd win a quarter. And then we ask you to make the same choice again. But of course, we don't want to lose too much money, so we make the task very difficult. And what's right on one trial could be wrong on the next trial. So you kind of have to keep adjusting your guesses about the red or blue square based on the cumulative outcomes, the average outcome, which one is more valuable at any given point in time. So this is showing you how we set up the payout for what we're calling the red or blue decks. Okay? And these are trials over time. So what we do is we change the likelihood of winning given a choice of red or a choice of blue. It's noisy the whole time and it reverses. Okay? So different phases, you're doing this for about 200 trials, and you can never really solve it based on a single trial. You have to accumulate information over several trials to know that the red is on average more likely to yield a reward here, and the blue is on average more likely to yield a reward here. Okay? So this kind of ability to track the average is precisely the kind of thing we now know from many people's work is one of the key things that the striatum is sort of communicating to the rest of the brain, this kind of updating of choices based on reward. Okay, so how do we then test memory for individual episodes? What we do here is we add a feature to the task where, in addition to the red deck of cards and the blue deck of cards on each trial, there are these objects that are unique. Each object only appears one or two times in the entire task. Okay? And so you have to track now the value, the average value of the deck, the red or blue deck, but you also have to pay attention to what the object was that was chosen on that deck. Okay? So by having these two features, we can now manipulate the relevance of each of these sources of information separately. And what we do then is we basically have someone make a choice, let's say between red or blue deck for a reward. Here the reward can be anywhere between 0 cents and $1. So this is a high reward trial. And then several trials later, we show them the same object. Here the feather that was worth 75 cents appears again. But now it appears in a phase of the task where blue is the better deck to be choosing. And so we can ask, are people going to choose the blue deck, suggesting that they're responding based on the average value, or are they going to choose the red feather, given that the red feather was a high-value item before. So we can see which of the sources of memory or of learning are influencing the choices on each trial over about 200 trials. Okay? And we can contrast that on a trial-by-trial basis and across individuals. An important thing you should be asking yourself now is, well, if these things are either correlated or anti-correlated, will people just use one source of information? Right? So what this is showing you here is that the object value between 0 cents and $1 is not correlated with the deck value. So they're each independently predicting the outcome, and we can track people's choices from there. And we can isolate how the episodic one trial object influences choices and how the incremental average learning of the value influences choices. Okay, so first let me show you that people use either sources of information. So here what I'm showing you is behavior from 31 healthy young participants. And the first thing I want to show you is how likely people are to use memory for the object they've seen once before, this sort of episodic information. What I'm plotting here is the old object value between 0 cents and $1 plotted against the likelihood that people will choose the object they saw before. Okay? So people are doing what we expect them to do, which is they're much more likely to choose the objects the higher the value was last time. Suggests both that they have reasonable memory of what the object value was and that they're using it to guide their choices. It sounds pretty obvious, but this is actually one of the first demonstrations that people use single trial object value in this sort of reward learning task when they don't have to. They really can't, there's no reason for them to memorize it. They could go on the deck alone. Here's some behavioral evidence looking at whether people use the deck value as well, the value of the red or blue decks. Just showing you here trials since the reversal. So the farther a person is from the reversal, the more evidence they've accumulated that either the red deck or the blue deck is valuable. And then also the more likely they are to choose what is at that time the lucky deck. Okay. So this suggests that we have both evidence from behavior for both episodic and incremental influences, and that they're not correlated across subjects. So people are really seem to be updating as they're going along, using the best source of information for a given choice. And so that now sets us up to be able to ask, what is it then that modulates the relative influence of each source of information on people's choices? And one hypothesis we were curious about is that the uncertainty of the environment might lead to better encoding of single trial episodic values. So if your cafeteria is always reliable and you know what you're always going for, it makes sense to accumulate all the information you have. If you're going to a new cafeteria for the first time, or if the management keeps changing, that might be a context in which it makes more sense to pay attention to what happened and remember what happens on individual trials. So what we did is we took this reversal structure of the task here of the outcomes, and we are looking now at the, the memory for the objects at the most uncertain phases of the task, right around the reversal, plotted here in green, versus the more certain phases of the task. And this is just sort of a simple binned kind of analysis. We can also look at it trial by trial. And what we find is that when there's more certainty in terms of the deck value, the red or blue decks, people are less likely to remember and use what happened on each trial. And when there's more uncertainty, when it's a more volatile, uncertain environment, people are more likely to encode those single trial events. So it suggests that memories for uncertain events have a greater influence on later choices. Okay, so what have I shown you so far? So far I've shown you behavioral data only, suggesting that memory for specific samples guides value-based decisions. That decisions are more likely to be influenced by memories that were formed during periods of uncertainty. And I didn't show you this for time constraints, but I can tell you that there's a similar finding suggesting that decisions are more likely to be influenced by memories that are formed when you're making them in familiar contexts. So you're more likely to use memory for the past if you're in a more familiar context. If you're in a more novel context, you're less likely to use those sorts of memories to make decisions. And that episodic memory in that sense seems to support decisions about novel or rare options, things that happened only once, and that can trade off with sort of this cumulative averaged information. Okay, so the key question, of course, now that we have this task in hand, the question we've been interested in is what are the neural mechanisms by which that sort of trade-off and arbitration between different kinds of information plays out while people are dynamically making these decisions over 200 trials in the scanner.